FLD News. Tonight, we're diving into a major case linking finance, deforestation and human rights, the BNP Paribas case in Brazil. It all started on October 17, 2022, when the French bank BNP Paribas was put on notice by two NGOs, the Brazilian Comissão Pastoral da Terra and the French Notre Affaire à Tous, with the support of the Rainforest Action Network in the US. They accused BNP Paribas of financing deforestation and human rights violation through its support of the meat giant Marfrig. Now, Marfrig is Brazil's second largest beef producer, and investigations show its supply chain is tied to illegal deforestation, land grabbing from indigenous territories, and even forms of modern slavery on cattle farms. A study by the Center for Climate Crime Analysis found that between 2009 and 2020, Marfrig's operations were linked to over 120,000 hectares of illegal deforestation in the Amazon and in the Cerrado. Reports also show that some of its cattle came from ranches operating illegally on indigenous land, like Apiteraua, one of the most deforested areas in Brazil. Under former President Jair Bolsonaro, many protections for the indigenous lands were suspended, creating what activists call a climate of impunity. In February 2023, NGOs took the next step, filing a lawsuit against BNP Paribas, arguing that a bank could legally be held responsible for financing companies that destroy forests and violate human rights. This case matters because it raises a big question. Can financial institutions be held accountable for the social and environmental harm caused by the companies they fund? Now, let's go to Lison, our legal expert and special reporter direct from Sao Paulo, Brazil. She's here to help us understand what's at stake here. Lison, thank you so much for joining us tonight. What can you tell us about the context surrounding this case for Brazil and its relevance for Brazilian companies?
Thank you, Camille, and good evening from Sao Paulo. Here in Brazil, the Amazon is once again at the heart of a global concern, and this time the trade led straight to the country's booming beef industry. Despite official claims that cattle ranching isn't driving deforestation, recent data tells us a very different story. In 2024, deforestation across the Amazon jumped by 80% compared to the previous year, more than 6.7 million hectares lost. And wildfires continue to devastate parts of the forest, illegal cattle ranching remains one of the main culprits. In the northern state of Pará, thousands of hectares have been cleared illegally for pasture, forcing indigenous families and small farmers off their land. Human Rights Watch reports that some of these illegal ranches have sold cattle to suppliers of JBS, the world's largest meat company, a company that still cannot fully trace its indirect suppliers. Greenpeace Brazil has gone even further, revealing that cattle raised on protected indigenous lands were later transferred to JBS slaughterhouses, with meat exported to Europe, the UK, China, and Japan. The organization accused JBS of failing to honor its promise of zero deforestation and urges European government to rethink the EU-Mercosur trade deal, which critics say could reward destructive practices. And it's not just about JBS. Marfrig, Brazil's second largest beef producer, is now at the center of growing controversy. Environmental groups allege that Marfrig, too, has sold cattle linked to deforestation. But what makes this case even more international is its connection to European finance, in particular the French bank BNP Paribas. BNP Paribas has been accused of financing Marfrig through loans and bonds despite its own commitment to stunt funding projects tied to deforestation. That legal case is now making headlines in Europe, raising broader questions about corporate accountability and the responsibility of investors in the global climate crisis. With COP30 set to take place here in Brazil next year, all eyes are on how the country and its global partners will act to protect what's left of the Amazon. Thank you.
In Brazil's Amazon forest, the world's lungs are shrinking. Behind the chainsaws and the cattle ranches, there's a complex financial web, and at the heart of it, one of Europe's largest banks, BNP Paribas. This French banking giant is now facing legal action in France for its financial links with the Brazilian meat company, Marfrig, one of the biggest beef producers in the world. The accusation? Financing activities tied to deforestation and human rights violation. The core of the case rests on a unique French law, adopted in 2017, the Loi sur le devoir de vigilance, or the Duty of Vigilance Law. Under this law, large French companies like BNP Paribas have a legal obligation to identify and prevent serious risks to human rights, the environment, and health, not just in their own operation, but throughout their entire value chain. Subsidiaries, suppliers, and even clients anywhere in the world. What makes this case so significant is that the alleged violations happen in Brazil, but BNP Paribas can be held accountable in France because it failed, according to the plaintiffs, to take proper vigilance measures before financing Marfrig. It's a striking example of extraterritorial accountability, French law reaching across borders, holding a French financial actor responsible for harms committed abroad. In contrast, there is no equivalent legal framework in Brazil or within the Mercosur bloc. Brazil has environmental and labor laws, for example, those protecting the Amazon or prohibiting forced labor, but there's no overarching duty of vigilance forcing companies to track and control their supply chains. Companies like Marfrig or GBS often adopt voluntary codes of conduct or zero deforestation pledges, but these commitments are not legally binding. If they fail, there is usually no sanction. At the regional level, Mercosur also likes binding rules on corporate vigilance or deforestation. Most obligations with real teeth actually come from abroad, like the French Duty of Vigilance Law or the European Regulation on Imported Deforestation, which entered into force in 2023. In other words, without the French law, suing BNP Paribas for its role in financing deforestation would have been nearly impossible. But how exactly is BNP Paribas involved? To understand that, we have to talk about bonds. A bond is basically a loan made by investors to a company or a government. When a company like Marfrig issues a bond, it's borrowing money from whoever buys that bond, banks, funds, or individuals. In return, the company promises to repay the amount later with regular interests. Now, BNP Paribas' role isn't just to buy bonds, it organizes and markets them. The bank acts as an arranger or underwriter. It helps Marfrig design the bond, find investors, and even guarantees that the company gets its money. Sometimes BNP also invests directly, and increasingly, it markets these financial products as sustainability-linked bonds, meaning their financial terms depend on whether the company meets certain environmental targets. For BNP Paribas, these deals are highly attractive. They offer high returns, since emerging markets companies like Marfrig often pay higher interest rates. The bank also earns a significant fees and commissions for structuring and placing the bonds. And beyond profit, such partnerships strengthen BNP's ties with major corporate clients. But there's also a reputational element. By issuing sustainability-linked bonds, BNP can also present itself as a leader in green and sustainable finance, a booming sector in global markets. The irony, according to the plaintiffs, is that these so-called green bonds actually help finance activities linked to deforestation and rights violation, turning what should have been a climate solution into the case of a potential greenwashing. So we're seeing here is a paradox. What's financially profitable, global reach, high return, ESG branding, becomes legally risky under the duty of vigilance law. The plaintiffs argue that BNP prioritized profits over due diligence, and by financing Marfrig without ensuring that its supply chains were free of deforestation and labor abuse, BNP allegedly failed its vigilance duty, and thus became complicit indirectly in environmental harm. How does this translate into legal action in Europe? Here with us to talk about how this case sparked a broader debate about the legal duties of banks under the French duty of vigilance law is legal expert in Paris, Valentin BREMILTS.
Thank you, Camille. Here in Paris, this case took a remarkable legal turn. On October 17, 2022, the French NGO Notre Affaire à Tous, together with the Brazilian pastoral CPT and the Red Forest Network in the US, formally notified BNP Paribas, accusing the bank of financing Mafriq, the second largest beef producer in Brazil. Just a few months later, on February 2023, BNP Paribas was taken to court under French duty loi de vigilance, a law that requires companies to prevent human rights abuse and environmental damage through their value chain. The NGO claims that BNP Paribas helped fund activities directly linked to illegal deforestation, land grabbing from indigenous communities, and even forced labor on cattle farms supplying Mafriq, according to the CCA, between 2009 and 2020. Mafriq slaughterhouses were connected to over 120,000 hectares of illegal deforestation across the Amazon River. The plaintiff argued that BNP failed to act responsibly, continuing to finance Mafriq despite repeated warning from Greenpeace, Reporter Brazil, and human rights about major traceability gap and human rights violation. For many observers, this law should mark a turning point and climate corporate accountabilities. It seeks to hold liable financial institutions not just for where it invests, but for the environmental and social consequences of this investment. In France and across Europe, this case resonates strongly with the upcoming EU corporates' due diligence and with the ongoing debates around the EU-Mercosur trade agreements criticized for its potential to worsen deforestation in South America. Therefore, this BNP Paribas vs Mafriq case could become a landmark precedent, redefining how banks can and must go to ensure that money isn't fueling climate destruction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Valentin. This case clearly shows how environmental and financial accountability are becoming more and more connected. Lison, help us understand the legal dimension. What gives the French court the power to hold a bank responsible for deforestation happening all the way in Brazil?
Thank you, Camille. And before we wrap up tonight, let's take a closer look at the legal side of this story, because the impact of Brazil's cattle industry now stretches far beyond the Amazon. The complaint accuses banks and insurers of money laundering and concealment, arguing that they financed companies like Mafriq or GPS, despite clear environmental and human rights risks. At the heart of the case is France's 2017 Duty of Vigilance Law, a pioneering regulation that requires large French companies to identify and prevent serious risks to people and the planet, not only in their own operations, but also through their global partners and clients. This is what makes the case so groundbreaking. Even though the deforestation and the rights violations are happening here in Brazil, French courts can still hold BNP Paribas accountable if it failed to take adequate precautions. Brazil itself has no equivalent law. Likewise, for the regional system Mercosur, companies here are not legally required to monitor or control their supply chains. So this French legislation effectively fits that gap, giving victims and NGOs a way to target the financial bakers of environmental destruction abroad. It's an unprecedented form of legal accountability, one that could reshape how banks operate when it comes to climate and human rights due diligence. As the Amazon burns and the world prepares for COP30 here in Brazil, this case shows just how interconnected the fight against deforestation really is, from the forest of Para all the way to the financial district of Paris. Thank you.
That's all for today's report on BNP Paribas. Thank you again, Lison and Valentin BREMILTS, for your appreciated expertise. We now move on to the worldwide phenomenon. Taylor Swift just released her 12th album, already breaking records. Let's now see how it has affected the music industry.